Looking for Absolution. It was a warm spring evening, so John and Sarah Smith had left the window shutters open. A gentle breeze blew fresh air around the central room of the house, raising up a few sparks from the fire that twirled as they danced up the chimney. As the sun dropped below the trees, the dogs came to lie by the fire and closed their eyes in contentment. The baby fell asleep, and they brought over some mending to do a bit of work on before their first sleep. Suddenly, all three dogs' heads jerked up and their ears pricked up tall. First one, then another, then all three rose to their feet, hackles raised, and ran around the room barking loudly. Alarmed, John grabbed the fire iron and went to the door, holding it aloft and calling out, "Who's there?" But it was Sarah who saw him. By the light of the rising moon, glancing over towards the open window, she saw the face of a man peering through the bars. His face was pale but covered in dirt, and his eyes were like dark hollows. He did not appear to move or speak, but simply stood stock still and stared into the house. Sarah screamed and, unable to form a coherent thought, pointed at the window before stumbling across the room to stand in front of the cradle. John inched around the walls, fire iron raised, but by the time he reached the window, the face had vanished. John pulled the shutters closed quickly and skipped the first sleep altogether that night, keeping watch with the dogs, but they saw nothing else. The next night, John and Sarah's neighbour Thomas Fletcher nipped out of his house after sunset to use the privy. He took a little longer than strictly necessary. The night was warm, and he could hear the sounds of the children resisting their first sleep from inside the house. When he finally emerged to return to the house, the children's chattering having quietened down a bit, as he turned towards the door, the moonlight revealed a human figure standing in the doorway. It looked to be the size and shape of a man, standing with his back to Thomas, facing the door of his home. "Hey, who's there?" called Thomas, walking cautiously towards the figure. As he called out, the cat leaped out of an open window and started its nightly patrol of the vegetable garden, only to stop and screech at the stranger. Its back arched and teeth bared, the animal looked wilder and fiercer than Thomas had ever seen it. The figure turned briefly to look at the cat, then spun around in the opposite direction and moved off into the shadows of the abandoned house next door more quickly than Thomas would have thought possible. Thomas shook himself and hurried into the house to check on his wife and children. They had heard the screeching of the cat, but had not noticed anything else. The thing had made its way to the other side of the village by the following night. William and Marjorie Brewster, newly married, were living in a large, newly built cottage with 3 rooms that had yet to be filled with children. With just the 2 of them and 1 dog, the nights were quiet after sundown, and when the window shutters were open, even the thick cob walls could not keep out even the smallest sound from outside. Just like John and Sarah's dogs, it was the dog who alerted them first. His ears went up, his hackles were raised, and he started sniffing all around the edge of the house, checking every door and below every window for something he could not find. Then they heard, over the sounds of the crackling fire, a weird sound coming from outside. It sounded at first like footsteps, like someone wearing boots walking across the packed earth near the house. But there was a strange, dragging quality to the footsteps, like this person was not quite sure how to walk and was struggling to move their legs and feet. William carried a candle over to the open window to investigate. He jumped back in shock as he leaned out towards the small window, only to see the shadow of a man lurching towards him, walking towards the window from the door. The man was dirty and unkempt looking, though his clothes were expensive and well made. He stared at William with dark eyes and seemed to be limping in some way, for his walk was awkward and stilted. But then William cried out and shouted, "Who's there?" And suddenly the figure seemed to lose its limp and moved away quicker than William's eyes could follow into the night. William shuddered. The thing had an evil look in its coal-black eyes, and it chilled him to the bone. He too missed his first sleep of the night that night, and was restless through most of his second sleep as well. Robert Foxton was not yet married, and was still living with his parents in their home on the edge of the village, the other side of the churchyard. He had been out for supper with the family of a young woman he was hoping to marry, and had stayed late for a cup of ale. It was full dark by the time he made his way back past the churchyard, carrying a candle in an enclosed lantern. It was cloudy that night, and there was not much else to light his way, as the moon and stars were obscured by rolling rain clouds that threatened to soak him at any moment. He heard scuffling sounds behind him, and turned around to see several of the village dogs seemed to be following him. A few of them turned their noses towards the churchyard and started to bark, their ears up and their teeth bared. Robert peered out into the churchyard. Among the wooden grave markers peppered across most of the churchyard and in front of the unmarked mound of the plague pit towards the rear, he could see the handful of stone headstones erected for some of the local landowners and wealthier yeomen. The freshest was that of Robert de Boltby's eldest son, also named Robert, who had died only a week or so before. There was some sordid story attached to his death, Foxton seemed to remember, but he was not quite sure of the particulars. It was a handsome gravestone the father had given his son, quite large, with a beautifully carved skull as a memento mori at the top, and the earth of the grave underneath was still fresh. As Robert Foxton raised his lantern to peer out into the churchyard, the dogs came to surround him, sitting or standing in a protective circle around his legs, all staring wide-eyed at the headstone of Robert de Boltby the Younger. And as Foxton watched, his lantern threw its shadows across the mound of earth so that it looked like the top layer of the soil was moving. And then, as the dogs started to bark more and more ferociously, Foxton realised that this was not a trick of the light. The fresh earth on de Boltby's grave really was moving around, as if a mole was digging its way up towards the surface, ready to burst out into the night air. But it was not a small blind mole that emerged from the grave. Instead, Foxton saw human fingers break free of the dirt and emerge slowly, followed by wrist and arm and shoulder, and finally the whole top half of a man pushed itself out of the grave, followed by the bottom half as the man-thing hauled itself out of its tomb and lay for a moment on the ground next to the headstone. Foxton stepped back a bit in shock. The thing seemed sometimes to shift its arms and legs very slowly and awkwardly, as if struggling to work stiff limbs, but then it would suddenly move faster than any normal man. Before he knew what was happening, it stood in front of him in the road, staring into his eyes, dirt crumbling off its crushed jacket and felt hat. They stood like that for a few moments, and then the corpse of Robert de Boltby the Younger simply lurched away into the village, the dogs following him at a slight distance, barking and howling the whole time. Foxton resisted the urge to chase down the thing there and then, unsure whether he would have any chance of catching it. Instead, he hurried home, deciding to come back with some help as soon as he could. Marjorie Brewster came from a long line of alewives, and her mother and grandmother had thankfully been spared by the plague. Thanks to their family's recipes, she brewed a particularly fine barley ale. So it was in William and Marjorie's spacious home, lured by the promise of freshly brewed ale, that Robert Foxton gathered his friends and neighbours the following evening after supper. "I have heard rumours about de Boltby the Younger," said John Smith. "He thought himself, being a gentleman, to be above his neighbours, and he did not take no for an answer." John glanced awkwardly at Marjorie, who grimaced. "There was some scandal around his death, wasn't there?" asked Robert. "Yes, you are right," nodded Thomas Fletcher. "A villein here in Kilburn, Walter Tyler I think he was called, had married without the Lord's permission. I think Walter thought such customs were old-fashioned and outdated, but the Lord of the Manor did not agree. He hired a man from down Cotswold way to teach Walter a very final lesson. This man did not know the village. The younger de Boltby agreed to show him where Walter and his wife lived and get him out quickly before the murder was discovered. Their plan went off almost without a hitch, except that Walter's brother was on his way for a visit that night and caught the two men scurrying away from his brother's home between first and second sleep. It was dark, and he did not recognise the stranger from Cotswold, but he had a lantern and could clearly see de Boltby. When he got to Walter's house, he found his brother and sister-in-law dead in their beds, stabbed in their sleep." "What happened to de Boltby then?" asked Foxton in horror. "The brother ran into him a few days later, walking by a field outside the village, and smashed his head in with a longstaff in revenge," replied Thomas. "I don't know what happened to the brother. He disappeared. Presumably he's living as an outlaw somewhere out beyond the moors." "It is no wonder he does not rest easy in his grave," said William Brewster. "But why is he wandering through the village and lurking around our homes at night? Does he want something?" "I care not what he wants," exclaimed John. "He is a menace to all of us. He is terrifying our families and dragging our dogs out, barking and following him around for half the night. What can we do to get rid of him?" "We need to fetch the priest, I think," said Thomas. "He can conjure this spirit and find out what it wants, and how to send it back to hell or purgatory or wherever it came from, and leave us alone." "We need to capture the thing first," said Robert. The priest cannot conjure a spirit out of thin air, and this thing has not shown any inclination to go anywhere near the church or the parsonage. Rather, it leaves the churchyard as soon as it is able. At that moment, the sound of dogs barking broke the quiet of the night. All 4 men went to William's door and held lanterns high to see as far as they could down the village street. A dark shape was limping down the road. It passed by the abandoned cottages that lined the street, but stopped at every inhabited house to peer in through the window, all the while followed by what looked like every dog in the village, keeping a slight distance from the thing but barking incessantly at it. "It is seeking out the living," said Thomas. "It has no interest in the dead." "Well, we as the living will come to it," said Robert decisively. "We will wait by the churchyard from sundown tomorrow evening and catch this thing before it can start its nightly rounds. Are we all agreed?" Each man lifted his mug and nodded his agreement. Marjorie poured them all some more ale. The next night, all 4 men gathered around the kirkstile at the entrance to the churchyard at sunset. Robert Foxton stood tall, a longstaff in his arms. John Smith held a lantern and fidgeted, glancing nervously in the direction of his own cottage, where his wife sat up with the baby, guarded by their own dogs who were kept firmly inside. Thomas Fletcher stood statue still with another lantern, and glared at the elaborate headstone of the late Robert de Boltby the Younger, and William Brewster fortified himself with a mug of ale he had brought with him from the house. A few dogs paced around the men in a circle, huffing and growling, feeling the men's tension, their nerves on edge and senses sharpened. It started as before, with the dogs stopping and turning towards the churchyard, and then raising their canine voices as loud as they could, barking and hissing and growling at the graves. And then came the fingers creeping out of the earth on Robert de Boltby's grave, followed by wrist and arm and shoulder, and slowly the thing that had once been the younger de Boltby hauled itself out of its less than final resting place. As the thing used both arms to push itself out of the ground, William Brewster gagged on his ale. "Marjorie!" he yelled, and he dropped his mug and turned tail, running as fast as he could back to his cottage. John Smith watched him go, jumping about on his toes before muttering with some embarrassment, "I have to get to Sarah and the baby." And he was off too, scampering back to his own home with his lantern, where he flung himself through the door and sat up with the dogs for the rest of the night. Robert Foxton ignored them. Seeing the corpse lumbering towards the gate, he thought better of using the longstaff, dropping it and flinging himself at the thing, grabbing it around the waist and pushing it up against the kirkstile. "Hold him fast while I come to you," cried Thomas, watching from the road. "No," answered Robert, pinning the thing against the gate and leaning his whole body weight against it. "Go quickly to the parish priest," he told Thomas, "so that the ghost may be conjured. With God's help I will hold firmly what I have got until you both return." Thomas did not wait, but dropped his lantern and leapt over the wall and ran to the parsonage as fast as he could over the uneven ground of the graveyard in the dark. Robert was as good as his word, and held on to the late de Boltby the Younger, pushing the thing up against the gate and holding its arms down. Thankfully the priest was home, and once he understood Thomas' slightly garbled but clearly urgent request, he grabbed a lantern of his own, threw on a hooded cloak, and ran straight out of the house and over to the kirkstile. "I conjure you, spirit," the priest called out before he had even walked all the way there, out of breath from rushing around the church. "I conjure you that was once Robert de Boltby the Younger. In the name of the Holy Trinity and by the virtue of Jesus Christ, I order you, answer my questions." Breathing hard, the priest came to a halt in front of the kirkstile, facing Robert Foxton, who had his head down, entirely focused on holding his prisoner, the risen Robert de Boltby. When the thing finally spoke, the voice was not that of a mortal man, and it did not come from its mouth, nor its tongue, nor its throat. Instead, the hollow sound rose up from the creature's very bowels, like an echo bouncing around an empty cask. "I am conjured," it said. "I will answer." "You can let it go now, Robert," the priest said kindly, and Foxton sank to the ground with a sigh. The priest, flanked by Thomas Fletcher standing behind him, kept his eyes on the corpse and continued. "What do you seek among the living, dead thing?" the priest asked. "I seek absolution," the thing replied. "Very well," said the priest. "Confess your sins." And so it did, and it was a long list. De Boltby the Younger appeared to have respected the laws of neither man nor God in life, and Foxton could not help thinking to himself that the whole village was much better off now that he had met his maker. When the creature had finally finished by confessing his involvement in the murder of Walter Tyler and his wife, the priest blessed it and told it, "You are absolved of your sins. Now return to your rest, and those of the living who have borne witness return home and speak no more of what has happened here." Foxton and Fletcher retreated out to the road and watched as the corpse thing lumbered past the priest with a brief nod of thanks, and then dug itself back into its own grave. The last they saw of it was a single hand being pulled back under the earth, the fingers wiggling a little as if waving goodbye. The priest let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping. He came out to pat both men on the back, then wrapped his cloak around himself and picked his way back across the churchyard by the light of his lantern. Thomas's own lantern had gone out when he dropped it, so he and Robert parted ways and made their way home carefully along the road under the light of the stars. But with the undead creature finally resting in its grave, they no longer feared the dark. The end. Welcome back to Creepy Classics, the podcast retelling and discussing ancient, medieval and early modern ghost stories. I'm Juliet Harrison. We have new episodes every 2 months. Happy Halloween! This month's story was written in Latin around 1400 and presumably takes place in the late 1300s. It was written by a monk at Byland Abbey in Yorkshire. Kilburn and Boltby, the two villages mentioned in the story, are both very close to Byland Abbey. They are between York and Durham in North Yorkshire. Kilburn is known now for a white horse in the landscape, but that was created in 1857, so it didn't exist at this time. One of the words that I've taken from the original, or at least from the English translation of the original, is kirk style, a style or gate at the entrance to a churchyard, which is a Scots word, which suggests close connections between northern England and southern Scotland. I need to check the Latin, actually, because I do read Latin, but I read it in M.R. James's English translation. Yes, the M.R. James of the ghost stories. And I read it in his English translation rather than bothering to retranslate the Latin for myself. So that may be M.R. James's addition to use the word kirk style. But it's something Bram Stoker does in Dracula as well. He incorporates Scots words into the dialogue of people in Whitby. So certainly in the 19th century, it seems like there is strong connections between southern Scotland and northern England. I will have to go check the Latin of the original Byland Abbey story and see what the word is there that M.R. James has translated as kirk style, or see if it is kirk style in the original. I made several references to first and second sleeps. Throughout the medieval and early modern periods, the most common sleeping pattern in Europe was biphasic, dividing the night into first and second sleeps. So you go to sleep for a while, then you get up for a bit, get on with some stuff by the firelight, and then you have a second sleep. It's something that is sometimes recommended. There are some quite interesting YouTube videos from people trying it. It's something that we did for many, many centuries, but only stopped kind of getting into the Industrial Revolution, really. The abandoned houses mentioned in the story are the result of the Black Death, which was in England 1348 to 1349. This was the plague that originated in Asia, but then spread across Europe between 1346 and 1353. The Plague Pit, obviously, is also a remnant of that. The Black Death and the Children's Plague of the 1360s, so called because most of its victims were under 10 years old, had hit Yorkshire really hard. I haven't found reference to archaeological evidence of a plague pit near Kilburn, but I did find references to the village being hit really hard by the plague, that possibly as few as 1 in 7 might have survived in the village. So they must have buried the victims somewhere, so I have given them a plague pit by the church. Cob walls, like the walls of the village houses, are walls made of soil, water, straw, and possibly local materials depending on area, like limestone or clay. This period is towards the earlier end of the period known as the Little Ice Age. Depending how that's defined, definitions do vary. Springs and summers would still be reasonably warm, colder than they are now, but warm compared to winter for the people living through it. So that's why there's references to it being warm. We also have references to ale. Women were the majority of brewers up until around the time of the Black Death. They were known as alewives. But after the Black Death, the profession was mostly taken over by men, but in this period, not long after, there would still be some alewives around. Brewster as a surname is a reference to an alewife, so that implies that William's family have a history of it as well. I have had to make up all the names except for Robert de Boltby the Younger and Robert Foxton. So if I was making up their names, I would have given them different names. I had to say everybody's surnames over and over again, because this is very typical of British medieval history. Everybody has the same name. Everybody is called John, William, Thomas, Henry, Robert. That's about it. maybe, no, not really George in this period. Edward, maybe an Edward. I also had to come up with all the details of the murder, which are not provided in the story. The Byland Abbey story is quite short, and it makes reference to de Boltby the Younger being involved in a murder and covering it up. It sounds like he didn't commit the murder, but he was some kind of accomplice and covered it up afterwards. But I had to make up all the details of all of that. So I decided to make use of the declining system of serfdom in creating this story. Medieval society in England was very strictly hierarchical. They're very, very strictly defined social classes based on a combination of money and birth, but particularly based on kind of money and land ownership and so on. The lowest class of free people are husbandmen or freemen. This would be shopkeepers, local traders, skilled workers, freemen of towns, and some minor clergy. And then even below them might be domestic servants and beggars, but in between husbandmen and domestic servants are a class of people who are not free. They are not slaves, but they are serfs. So this is not chattel slavery, and in fact, it's not defined as a form of slavery at all. Slavery was actually illegal in England at this period, somewhat surprisingly, but they are not free. It is a form of forced labour, of unfreedom, which we usually refer to as serfdom. So villeins or serfs are legally unfree and completely subject to the will of the lord of the manor. They work the lord's land for him, normally 3 days a week, plus set tasks like ploughing and harrowing, depending on the time of year. And in return, they would have the use of an acre or two of land, which they would also have to pay rent for. Whatever they produced legally belonged to the lord, and they owned nothing. It is very, very similar to slavery. When a villain died, their heir had to give the lord what was called a heriot, which is their best animal or most valuable chattel. They weren't allowed to leave the manor, which is the area around the manor house in the village, for more than a day. And if a daughter married out of the manor or a widow refused to marry, they could be fined, or the widow could even be imprisoned. They basically had no rights apart from life and limb, just about, but they couldn't plead against their lords in royal courts, so basically they were completely at the lord's mercy. And they had to ask the lord of the manor's permission to get married, and the lord of the manor could say yes or no to a marriage. By the period that this story takes place, this system was declining and kind of collapsing in on itself in England. The timeline varies across different parts of Europe. There had been a series of disasters in England and in Europe more broadly, which had led to this decline. First, there was the 100 Years' War between England and France, 1337 to 1453. You'll notice that is slightly more than 100 years, but we historians are lazy, and it's easier to say 100 years. So, for that, many villeins are being drafted into military service, which they're not terribly happy about. There was a great famine, capital G, capital F, 1315 to 1317, possibly caused by climate change or a volcanic eruption or both. That obviously hit much of Europe. The Black Death, as we've already mentioned, 1346 to 1353 across Europe, but mostly 1348 to 49 in England. And then an attempt to collect a poll tax, the same tax paid by everybody, set off a revolt in 1382. And I have named my murder victim, my villain, Walter Tyler, after one of the leaders of the Peasants Revolt, Wat Tyler. Walter also happened to be one of my grandfather's names, so that just seemed like a good name to choose. As a result of these various disasters, and although the Peasants' Revolt was not successful in its immediate aims, a long-term result of the Peasants' Revolt as well was that the system of feudalism died out in England over the following decades. So I've used that as the basis for my murder, that I'm basically drawing on the tension between villeins and serfs who are slowly moving out of this system of serfdom and are expecting more rights and have higher expectations for life at this point, but a lord of the manor stuck in the old ways who doesn't want to accept that. The story also culminates in the priest conjuring the ghost. The monk who recorded these stories speculated that perhaps the ghost, or revenant, was wandering the village because he was waiting to see if anyone would come out and conjure him and give help to him in his necessity. 9 of the 12 ghost stories recorded by the monk at Byland Abbey involve conjuring a ghost, and the theme also comes up in other contemporary stories, like the French story of Guy de Corveau that I covered at Christmas on the podcast a few years back. Often in medieval ghost stories, the ghost needs to confess a sin, as here, which also fits with the other major theme of medieval ghost stories, which is purgatory. The majority religion in Europe at this time is, of course, Roman Catholicism. There are small numbers of people following other religions. The Sami people in the far north are following their traditional religion, and there are Muslims in Spain and Portugal, parts of what is now Spain and Portugal. And, of course, Eastern Europe is Greek Orthodox, but the majority of Europe, and certainly Western Europe, is Roman Catholic, so there's a lot of emphasis on the need to confess sins and be absolved. There are variations sometimes. Another of the Byland Abbey stories features a necromancer, which is kind of a catch-all term used for certain types of magic in the medieval period, as opposed to its classical meaning, which is more specifically raising the dead. But this necromancer conjures a vision of actually a living thief, but they lose the connection when the thief confesses and is absolved of the crime. Basically, this is the standard medieval method for dealing with a ghost. You conjure it in the name of Jesus and the Holy Trinity. You ask it questions if you want to, and Guy de Corveau gets interrogated on like the afterlife and purgatory and all sorts of things. And then you either obey its instructions or you get a priest to absolve it, or both. So the Byland Abbey stories don't all feature this method, but the vast majority do. If you want to read the 12 ghost stories recorded by the monk at Byland Abbey around 1400, they are available for free online in Latin and in the English translation by M.R. James. They're in a couple of places, but I used ninazamel.com, 12 medieval ghost stories. I did a bunch of research for this one, looking up all these little details of medieval life that I wanted to incorporate. I used Ian Mortimer's book, The Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England, which is really useful, Christopher Dyer's Making a Living in the Middle Ages, A. Roger Eckrich's At Day's Close, A History of Nighttime, which talks about the two sleeps. I used websites including kilburnyorks.com, which is the website for the village of Kilburn, archaeology.co.uk's article on peasant houses in Midland, England, English Heritage's article on haunted monasteries, medievalists.net on inside medieval homes, historytoday.com on the world of medieval dogdom, that was on the dogs, the BBC on the lost medieval habit of biphasic sleep, and dailyjstore.org on a pint for the alewives. And if you have full access to JSTOR, I also used a chapter from a book on ghosts or the nearly invisible spectral phenomena in literature and the media. That was Medieval Ghosts, The Stories of the Monk of Byland by Mike Hildebrandt. And I used an article from Comparative Studies in Society and History, Volume 18, Number 3, on violent death in 14th and early 15th century England by Barbara A. Hannawalt. On the subject of books, I am delighted to say that my third collection of short stories from this podcast is out now, Creepy Classics Haunting Tales for Winter. This will take you on a journey back in time through haunted Christmases, starting in Regency England, going via Reformation Scotland, medieval France, King Arthur's court, which really doesn't have a time period, so I just plonked it in the best place I could, and ending up in Viking Age Iceland. It's 7 short stories and a novella at the end, which is set in Viking Age Iceland. All but one of the stories were originally told on the podcast. The novella was my 3-parter during the early months of COVID on the hauntings at Froissar, which I have rendered as Frodiswater this time, so it sounded more poetic. Same place. The book exclusive story, which has not been told on the podcast, is the first one. It is the story of the Hammersmith Ghost, a tragic, true story of murder and mistaken identity in Regency London. So you can buy the book, or probably, let's face it, read the whole story in the sample on Amazon for that one. I have also made a video about the Hammersmith Ghost, about the true evidence for the Hammersmith Ghost on my YouTube channel at ClassicalJG if you are interested. All 3 Creepy Classics books are available from a variety of platforms, including Kobo, Apple, Barnes & Noble, Fable and others, as well as Amazon, in paperback or ebook. I also have a twice-monthly newsletter which you can subscribe to on Substack. And you can even buy Creepy Classics merch. If you know anyone who might like some merch with a Roman, a Greek and a Viking ghost on it for Christmas, then you can buy that at my website, julietharrison.co.uk, with the weird spelling of both my names. Juliet is spelled the French way, Juliette, and Harrison has 2 S's in it, Harrisson. This is an Irish thing. It comes from Central Ireland. I don't know why. Also, please assume that the Viking ghost is a shield maiden. When I designed my little design with my 3 historical ghosts, I didn't even think about the fact that I had made them all men. The Greek one is definitely male. He has a beard. I suppose that could be a character from a Greek play where there are women who dress up as men by wearing false beards. That is a thing that happens in Greek comedy in Lysistrata, so it could be one of those women. The Roman one is wearing a laurel wreath and a toga, so is either a man or a prostitute. So probably a man, but you could assume prostitute. The Viking, we can assume, is a shield maiden, if we want the ghosts to not all be men. I didn't even think of it when I designed it. Thank you so much for listening. Have a fabulous and spooky Halloween. And I'll be back at Christmas with one of the stories from Haunting Tales for Winter, which I haven't actually done on the podcast yet, but I am going to cover this Christmas. So if you want a sneak peek of the Christmas story, it is in that book. And I'll see you then. Creepy Classics was written and performed by Juliet Harrison. Music composed and performed by Ed Harrisson. And it was produced by Juliet Harrison with assistance from Birmingham Newman University.